Hi, and thank you to both of the previous speakers. I think you're going to notice that there's a bit of a theme developing here, and certainly the juries are something that I'll touch on, but Stephen's covered how they work so well, I'll be able to skip on through that part. I've talked about my presentation being engaging with a purpose, and I think both Stephen and Dominic talked about the purpose there. In South Australia, we have a Premier who is so committed and keen to talk about different forms of engagement that we're thinking about. I think it's not too bold to say that he would describe it as the purpose is reimagining government and reimagining the way South Australia works. So we're on a journey, we're not reimagined yet, but we are really working in a place where we are changing the way government is done in a lot of places. So I'm actually going to do a few little case studies rather than just one big one, and almost to give you a taste of how many different places we're playing in and where it's working and what's working best. So just to flip on there, we actually came up with a Better Together, which is what we call the whole policy framework of how we do engagement, and it's very IAP2 focused entirely. That's the spirit and the foundation of it, so hopefully that you know what I'm talking about with the IAP2, and I won't go into that detail. The thing that I think is most important about each of these principles is that they all reflect where we've done something wrong. So know who and why you're engaging reflects the fact that, you know, we did plenty of engagements where we didn't know who or why, or we'd actually already decided what we wanted to do, and it was a retrospective attempt at a fix. So these principles have come after, you know, they're a couple of years old now, but they've come after a couple of years of us trying and failing and doing things better and worse at different times. And so there's some real blood and sweat and tears in them, and there's dirty laundry as well as happy stories, and I think that's what makes them quite real. The Premier Weatherall, when he first became Premier, talked about the fact that government for too long had been announcing and defending. So he framed what he wanted to be was the debate and decide Premier. And this has been a really interesting leadership, I think, synergy, because lots of the people who work in community services, particularly in South Australia, had been sort of lamenting that they were trying to engage, and it's really hard when you're in a political system. And then we have the Premier coming from the top and saying, public service, government, you've got to change, you know, you're being way too expert-led, you know, only the experts, only the public service can know how engagement works. And so it's been really interesting. I think some of these case studies reflect the kind of top-down and bottom-up hitting in a really funny way, and we've had some great things come out of that. So just clicking on, this is a bit of a summary of where we've gone and what we're doing. The Your Say, clever little essay in the middle of Your Say, is our online site where people can go and look at the conversations. And we've avoided some of the things that were talked about in the paper to this conference about government sort of coming in and closing down people's comments and editing every comment and being scared of people's comments. We've jumped into that. We've had a number of citizens' juries. I think we're up to about 7. And so touching on some of the things Stephen said there, We've got one in my area at the moment about dog and cats, and about compulsory, are we going to compulsory desex all dog and cats? Are we going to have cat-free Kangaroo Island because there's so many feral cats there? There's a whole range of places. And if you want to get some people who aren't usually engaged in politics engaged, go and talk to them about dog and cats would be my suggestion. Wow. So there's a lot going on in dog and cats. We've had a citizens' jury on cycling, which at its core was actually asking people, how do we want to live as a society? Where does the role for cars? Where's the role for cycling? What does the middle of the city look like? And that one was really interesting. And the other one that just comes to mind too that I think people would be interested in is the debate between late night closing of pubs and bars. So what time of night should things close and what opportunities should be there? And that was another jury thing, which had been a really politically contentious discussion. We also have done things on funding my ideas, and Stephen talked about, I think really what the City of Melbourne's done is a bigger thing for the whole of the city. We've done lots of different ones in different parts of our government, but we've done one a lot about the community grants, because the criteria and the way as government that we delved into that, we made an entire industry out of criteria and values, but of course the values that were being decided on them were all the public servants who were doing the decision making's values, but we did it in an incredibly comprehensive and expensive way. It's been really interesting just to open that voting up to the public and say, here's the grant fund, let's see what the projects come. And every community cabinet that we have, we're now putting grant funds into that community and letting that community vote. And we're really doing our community cabinets, which I would say has been around for a long time in Australia and elsewhere. We're trying to do those differently as well, and actually having public servants and people go and have community meetings leading up to the community cabinet as well as on the day, and then follow up and a report within 90 days of being in that community, so that we're not just kind of the fly in, fly out, here's the cabinet, take a photo and move on. We're trying to rework some of the old ways in a more inclusive way too. So Department for Environment, Water and Natural Resources is my patch, and we are we're lucky in one sense because there is a whole lot of ways that people can engage that doesn't feel political in the environment, and volunteering is a really interesting one for me. And Stephen talked about the fact that citizens' juries in one sense are volunteering. There are a lot of ways where, particularly in regional communities, people are being able to help make decisions on what we do in our national parks or how we deal with threatened species in a way that is engaging with government, but they wouldn't necessarily see it in that way. And so when we're talking about all of the parts of engagement, we also talk about the way that being a volunteer works in there. So that flips on to how we categorise that. And community participation in activities is something that we really focus on as well. So case studies, the South Australian Strategic Plan, I won't delve into it too much because I worked on it for a number of years and I feel that you may never get me off the podium on it, but it is a really interesting one to look at. That's something, it's a few years old now, but it still resonates and it's still very much what leads the policy directions in our state. And we actually went out and we won an international award for it. And I think probably the crux of what we did here was actually linked policy outcomes that we open up to the community, but we also linked targets and measurable targets that we would talk about achievement. And we tried to, and I think, to moderate success, reframe what actually we would be measured and tested on. So there is a real focus in the plan about things like quitting smoking or lowering smoking rates. Government can't do that alone. We've got a huge part of it, but individuals do too. And so the targets had a whole lot of accountability that was at government level, but also very much at community level. And I hopped on so many different community events saying, this isn't the government's plan, this is South Australia's strategic plan, and even actually going through public service discussions who want to say, it's our plan, it's the government's, it's not theirs. And there was a lot of focus on that. So we've got, that's had a lot of iterations. We've had big public updates. We had 10,000 people actively involved in the last update of that, but that was a few years ago now. I think we'd be able to up that a lot more with a lot more of our online focus that we've been able to do. So 10,000 Australians, and it's the collective accountability that we really focus on, I think, with the SASP. And it's one that, there's so many things that governments do, and even the 100 targets and the 100 areas don't capture everything, but it does actually give people who are working on those areas that sense of where we're driving to and where we're going together. I'll just quickly show you the platform of how we've done a lot of this, and this is one you can jump onto and have a look, is very much an online platform, but with conversations kept up there, lots of engagement there, and hopefully you can read it. There's a number of things there that we've done on there, from the time zone issue, which is a big deal in South Australia, the cycling one that I mentioned, and transforming health. I haven't gone into it as a case study, and it's something that's still live now, but imagine, 5 or 10 years ago, a minister starting a community conversation by actually on the front page of the paper saying, we've looked at the data and 500 South Australians died unnecessarily in our hospitals last year. I mean, that I think is a sign of where we've moved, because we are using the data, saying it out loud, putting some ugly truths out there, and then getting the community to be part of that conversation and change. And this is part of the answer that we're seeing there, and doctors and nurses are very involved, is that we're trying to spread ourselves so thinly that the specialisation that you would have was just being lost. So that I think is a brave experiment, and certainly one that's progressing and worth looking at. I'll just flick on to the MurrayDarling Basin plan. if there's any Victorians or New South Wales public servants in the audience, I feel that, please don't quote me here now, it's still a contentious place. But I think the thing, and there's so many different elements of this, the reason that I think looking at what happened with the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is really important in terms of community engagement is there was so much complexity in this work. Water just has so many parts of it that are hard to understand. We've got groundwater, surface water, we've got water trading systems, we've got different weather patterns having different impacts, we've got El Nino, we've got climate change, we've got communities who are irrigating in different ways depending on what their patch is. And that's just almost the landscape before you actually get into sort of doing forward projections on the river in 10, 20 and 30 years. And what we really focused on, and this is what I think was really important, is that people who had probably just thought it was too complicated to talk about the river, we were able to actually engage them in different ways so that the connection to river or connection to water security in our state and actually connecting people outside of South Australia into why we thought saving the river was really important. So the people who lived in cities in Melbourne and Brisbane and Sydney were actually being part of that conversation too. Some things are local when you live them, but they're national in their effect. And that was one of the things we really focused on. And I think mobilising the power of the community is a point of this one, but also not over complicating issues or trying to make the complicated accessible, which I'm not sure that public servants have always put as our number one focus when we're trying to engage. I really wanted to put up the Royal Commission into nuclear fuel cycle because I think it does, for those of you who aren't living in South Australia, demonstrate that the Premier is really serious about putting things on the table here. These are issues that are incredibly controversial and have been controversial within the life of this government, his government. It's not something that that people were expecting, I think it's fair to say. And I think it's also fair to say that something like a Royal Commission, I don't think has probably ever counted in our lists of examples of ways you can engage differently. To me, as a public servant, Royal Commissions mean someone killed someone, probably the government. Bad news. However, what we actually really thought about is what is the most concrete way that you can demonstrate to the public that there won't be political or ministerial interference in the report at the end. If you're actually going to have a conversation with everyone and get evidence and views and put it all together, how do you stop the ministers and the Premier and the Cabinet changing it or not releasing it? Actually, a Royal Commission is what we looked at, and it's what the Premier decided to do because of the sense of actually really wanting to demonstrate in the most serious way he could that this was not a closed decision place, this was an open decision place. And the former Governor of South Australia, who's probably one of the most trusted individuals you could find, a judge or a former Governor, Kevin Scarce is leading this Royal Commission with that mandate to actually report direct to the Parliament, not through Cabinet, about the findings. And I think there's a lot to look at and see from what we get out of this Royal Commission. The fourth one, and my final one, is a little bit of a one that I really want to show you because it's from my own department, particularly proud of it because it's got Minecraft in it. And what for me was really interesting is that we talked about all the different ways of engaging people. It's not very often that we delve into the kids below 18, yet particularly in my department, I'm trying to get people into national parks, I'm trying to get kids off the screens and into the parks. So how do we get them off the screen? Well, maybe we'll use the screen to get them off the screen. So we did this competition about designing a national park. Now, we don't have humongous buckets of money, but we do actually have some capacity to do some new designs in national parks. So it's a real thing, like we actually can do it. And we got kids and schools engaged in this. And I'll just flick through and show you, hopefully all of you have seen Minecraft in its various forms, some of the things that we managed to get here on the side. The winning team designed a huge leafy sea dragon, which is South Australia's aquatic emblem. I was going to get the wrong word there. And they made a huge leafy sea dragon as the centrepiece in the part of this park. And we just got coverage all over the world for this, which of course wasn't our intention, but it really helped feed back into people thinking about parks differently, the uptake of kids going into parks, has been huge. It's had a great feed on to our nature play programs that we're doing, and it actually has also made people think differently about how you do and can engage. So that one, I suppose, had the gimmick aspect, but it actually was thought about what are we trying to do and what are we trying to change. And there's the final one of their designs. They were really great, and it was a fun thing to be part of. So finally, what I've learnt, I think the thing is that there's a risk that we all think that engagement has a sort of toolbox and you just do it this way and it will be great. And I fear that we'll fall into our own trap if we pretend that you have to do it a certain way and that it never fails. It can fail. The failures need to be successes. We've had a citizens jury in my department again looking at southeast drainage and how we pay for drainage that didn't come up with an answer that, you know, it's a place, it's a tension place. And again, as I said at the start, the better together principles are that reflective sense of what's worked and what hasn't. So turn what you've learned and what you've seen not work and make that what you do next. Where things can go wrong point, I think, is probably a place where our questions might go. And to me, it gets into that really difficult part of, one, I would say, this is probably my number one thing that I bang the drum about, is for those of us whose job it is, a public servant or a person who works in the area, you know, we're spending 24/7 on it. We know that there's a lot we've known, we've spent years on it. It's hard not to just jump into that expert posture. But when we do, it's very hard then for someone who's not an expert but interested to have any voice in it. We shut them out just by our very expert place. Even if we're welcoming and saying, we'd love to hear your view, I'll just give you a sort of 5-hour lecture on all of the fine points. It's not actually an engagement that way, and it's us needing to think differently about how expertise can be used in engagement that I think is a really important thing to think about. And for me, in a department where climate change is one of my areas and I'm really wanting to engage the public in a climate change conversation, I think the combination of the expertise part of climate change and the political nature of people feeling like it's a political side to engage is a really disappointing thing, because it does stop people actually jumping into an issue that they're probably really interested in for their children, for themselves, for the way they live their lives. And it doesn't have to be the way it is here in Australia, because plenty of other countries are talking about climate change in a different way. So that's something that I think is really important. The second and final one I'll leave in is, again, this genuineness and authenticity that all of the speakers have talked about. If you go in there with something that's already pre-decided, the public will sniff it out in a second, let alone the staff working on it. And we need to give people that confidence, because engaging doesn't mean that everyone will get what they want. And if we're not clear about what the parameters are, and that everyone in the engagement, all 10,000 people, aren't going to get every little thing that they want, we'll actually stop that trust loop, you know, lowering, and we will actually increase that level of distrust, because we'll get disengagement, you know, we'll just get anger. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to be careful about when we're framing things, is thinking through why, all of the principles of why and how we can do it well. And there are just so many things to me that I feel like we're at the beginning of a journey in governments at all levels in Australia, and there's so many more exciting places we can go. So I commend ANZOG for getting us thinking more about it today, and I'll be really interested to hear what other people are up to around Australia. Thanks.